Hey Dunchbags, what's going on? It's Landon Remixes here, and it is time, finally, for my review of the debut album from RIOT, Dogma Resistance. RIOT is an Israeli bass music DJ and producer duo based in LA. RIOT is typically known for their wild, metal-infused take on dubstep, though I actually personally found them through Pins and Needles, the tune that they did interpolating Sam Sadler's viral My Dubstep 3 video. Though I ultimately ended up sticking around thanks to singles like Wake Up with Keizo, Disorder, Got Your Love with Dirty Phonics, as well as their remixes of Bamf and Battle Sirens. The moment that I really started getting hooked on RIOT's music, though, was when they started incorporating more storytelling elements into their songs, that is with The Mob in 2018. A song that I will admit does have some glaring issues. I'm not all that crazy about the virtual RIOT Kill the Noise-esque presets used in the drops of the song, and I guess I also don't think the random hype-up samples work all that well in the song's favor. It kind of pulls you out of the listening experience, and I've seen other people kind of have the same issue with that too. However, the song was really the first look we got at RIOT trying to do world building with their music, weaving in orchestral elements, and ultimately just creating an immersive story. Two of the major highlights of the song for me being the unsettling music box melody toward the end of the track and the initial build-up into the drop, which I have completely memorized at this point.
Tonight I want to talk to you about violence in our cities. It's been the brutality of a mob. I will use whatever force is necessary to restore order.
Critically speaking, I don't think The Mob is RIOT's best work, but it amazed me the first time I listened to it and continues to do so every time I get back into it. Speaking completely on subjective terms, The Mob to this day is still my favorite work that RIOT has put out. Flash forward to now in 2019, about a year and a half after the release of The Mob, RIOT has put out an entire album surrounding the theme and the story that was originally teased on that song. Perhaps one of the most anticipated releases in MONSTERCAT's entire catalog, thanks to the success of singles like Overkill. And even though, in my opinion, that song had a pretty glaring issue as well, I was still nonetheless looking forward to hearing this album and seeing RIOT kind of put a cap on this entire story that they've built up over these last couple years. I had a lot of confidence that RIOT would be able to kind of tie everything together in a nice little bow. I mean, RIOT had done such a good job storytelling and world building up to this point, I had no reason to think that they weren't going to succeed. However, even though I wouldn't say this album is necessarily a disappointment, I would say my expectations weren't quite met in the way that I had hoped they would be. My main thing going into Dogma Resistance is that I really wanted to see all these different scenes portrayed on singles like Aiwa and Jungle Fury kind of connect to each other, because in my mind they didn't really make all that much sense in an album context unless RIOT was able to meaningfully kind of transition everything from one track into another. I really wanted to see Dogma Resistance kind of connect everything in a way that I guess made sense, especially because in my mind the story was going to start with Overkill with the machine booting up and ending with The Mob with the machine ultimately being destroyed, and I guess every other song kind of sitting in between that. I kept trying to wrap my mind around how everything was going to fit together, and needless to say, RIOT ended up delivering an album that, storytelling-wise, did something that I really didn't anticipate. And not to say that doing something different than I expected is necessarily a bad thing. In fact, far from it. I'm just not entirely sure that the story of this album is exactly satisfying. First off, there's honestly not a lot of new material here for fans to be able to connect the dots between the songs that build the structure of this album. Discounting the overture, the interludes, and the bonus track, there's really only 2 new songs here, and that's Blackwater and the Disorder VIP, the Rebirth, and honestly, I don't really feel that Disorder adds all that much to the album's story either. It really just reiterates a lot of the elements of Overkill. The Overture is actually probably the most telling song on the entire album in terms of the story, in terms of giving listeners a look at what the heck is exactly going on this project. Even then, a good chunk of the song is taken up by excerpts from The Mob, and then the kind of TV reporter intro is very ambiguous too. It's not very specific on what exactly is going on. I mean, this whole story began developing 2 days ago, and from that point on, these terrible events kept on snowballing in a reign of terror that has not evaded. It's not exactly specific as to what the heck is happening. The last leg of the song is a bit more specific, and I'll read an excerpt here. The machine shall fall to the ground and vanish up into thin air. There is no wrong, nor is there right, only freedom for which we fight. I'll skip ahead a little. In search of redemption, we find each other. We dream of home, but never sleep. We find comfort in one another. In the face of peril, we shall not flee, because together we're stronger, etc., etc. It's kind of easier to tell what exactly is happening. So basically, my interpretation of this album is that this machine comes down from space in order to enslave and oppress humanity. In the midst of this, all of these different opposing groups have to kind of band together in order to defeat the machine. Each of these groups are kind of illustrated track by track. For example, you've got these tribal warriors on Jungle Fury. You've got a group of outlaws on Blackwater. You've got these Middle Eastern camel riding warriors on Aiwa. You know, you get the picture. And then on The Mob, all of these groups kind of join together in order to fight this machine and partially succeed at taking it down. The machine shuts down and it seems defeated, but then of course, like epic final boss style, the machine boots up once again into a whole new form, and that's when the grand finale of the album, Overkill, happens. And wouldn't you guess, there's no happy ending to this story. The rebellion loses, they're completely crushed by the machine, and they are put to sleep at the end of the song, kind of Matrix style, and yeah, the album pretty much ends there. And I know some people are going to immediately disagree with that interpretation, but to me there's no indicator that the Mob actually wins at the end of the album, especially with that weird outro on Overkill. It just doesn't make sense if the machine doesn't win. It's obvious enough to me that the machine represents the government. It's not the first time the government has been referred to as the machine. I mean, look at Rage Against the Machine. They're literally like an anti-government band. That's their whole thing. Plus, I think the George Bush LA riots speech samples used on The Mob are also really telling. I think that the album is a dystopian warning about where the world could go if we're not careful, that if we want to keep our freedoms, we have to learn to set our differences aside and band together. I feel like some people are going to refute this theory and cite Take That, saying, you know, it's a fun party song, it's a celebration of the machine falling, and, you know, I'd say that it's, for one, a bonus track, so it's not technically part of the album's canon, and secondly, I'd say that even if it is technically part of the canon, it could very well be a dream state that the resistance is experiencing after they're defeated by the machine and put to sleep. I also think that this interpretation leaves the floor more open to Riot doing more albums and projects in this same storyline in the future, rather than just, you know, defeating the machine and having the entire thing end. Why wouldn't they ride off the success even further? But yeah, that's pretty much my interpretation of it, and like I said before, I don't think it's executed in necessarily the best way possible. First of all, I wish that the interludes served more as storytelling tools rather than just instrumental transitions between songs. Ferry Corsten's Blueprint is an excellent example of an album that does that in a great way, having interludes between every track, really giving listeners a look into where exactly they're at in the story and what's going on. Dogma Resistance, while each song pretty much transitions seamlessly into the next, it doesn't do necessarily a great job of putting all the pieces together. And you know, that entire interpretation I came up with obviously wasn't given to me. I had to kind of put those pieces together myself, and it's really the only way that this project makes sense to me, because it's not like there's a protagonist here that's traveling around to these different locations. Everything's just so disconnected from track to track. Like, how does the jungle on Jungle Fury have anything to do with the Old West in Blackwater or the desert in Aiwa? It really doesn't. And this review may or may not age well, because I know Riot is putting out that Dogma Resistance comic pretty soon, which is supposed to accompany the album and kind of explain everything. But you know, you have to understand from my perspective that I'm just trying to get the story out of the album itself and not have to look at other outside resources. I'm reviewing it as an album, not as, you know, the entire thing surrounding it, I guess. So yeah, conceptually, I don't think Dogma Resistance was executed in the best way it possibly could be. But what is my opinion on the album sonically? Well, I'd have to say I like it at the very least. I mean, Riot has been consistently putting out some of the best BROSTEP music, you know, in that scene over these last couple years, and I'd say Dogma Resistance is a really good representation of that, weaving in loads of orchestral and metal influence, I think particularly well on Blackwater, The Mob, and Overkill. We even get a funky disco-influenced electro tune with Take That, which came completely out of left field for me. Haven't heard that from Riot since Jazz Cat Funk, but it's a phenomenal song. I mean, the guitar synth battle toward the end of the song is just insane. And I would have to say that Riot does a very acceptable job theming their songs, world building around each theme. They do that particularly well on Jungle Fury and Aiwa, which from a critical standpoint I'd say is the highlight of the entire album. It's very well put together, uses its samples in a creative way that doesn't feel too obnoxious. However, in the back of my mind, I'm still thinking, you know, most of these songs are still tying back to BROSTEP. And with that, a lot of the cliches and tropes that have been very prevalent in the genre over the last couple years. Like, Jungle Fury is honestly such a solid tune, and it's got an amazing build-up, but for me it's always going to be the song on the album that had an Infected Mushroom-influenced PSYTRANCE drop. The VIP of Disorder, while I think it is a good listen, I'm always going to think about it every time I listen to it, that the original was really one of Riot's most unique cuts, and then they turned it into something that pretty much just has Woolly's name written all over it. And while I think the Neurofunk drop is pretty refreshing, the "it's time for drum and bass" dialogue is always going to pull me out of the album's story experience. Blackwater, like I mentioned before, is one of the best on the album when it comes to storytelling and world building, but the drops are too lackluster for me to really get into it. And then of course there's Overkill, which in my opinion is one of the best infusions of metal and dubstep the world has ever seen, but at the same time has way too many freaking fake outs. Overall, while I'd say Dogma Resistance is certainly worth a listen and definitely worth giving a spin, I can't help but think that it just could have been so much more. And while I can definitely see how Dogma Resistance would be a nice story-driven deviation from the, you know, current dubstep landscape for a lot of people, I don't really see this album as being the kind of thing that's going to hold up for decades or years even. For Dogma Resistance, I am feeling a decent 7 out of 10. As always, if you guys haven't listened to this album yet, I have the Spotify link down in the description below. And if you have listened to this album, make sure to let me know what you think about it in the comments section. I would like to take a brief moment to shout out my sponsor, Audionamics. They make awesome audio source separation tools, and yeah, I love their tools. I think if you're a DJ or producer or an audio engineer of some other kind, their software is absolutely essential. If you click the sponsor link down in the description below and you decide you want any of their products, I'll get a nice 10% commission off of it, so really, it's the best way to support me at the moment. Anyway, I'm Landon Remixes, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.